So I cut into the property through the trees to sneak in, but Josh was literally nowhere in sight. I saw his fort, so I looked around. When I could confirm he wasn't anywhere in sight, I approached his fort to grab the jewel. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice yelling out, "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned in the direction it came from, and it was an older woman at the front door of the neighbor's house. I called back that we're playing a game. She responded with, "Your brother's in here." I was very confused. I started walking towards the front steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face got clearer. To my 8-year-old mind, she looked a lot older than she probably was. When I got closer to the house, I noticed that one of the upstairs windows, there was someone looking out at me. For a second, I actually thought it was Josh. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black bean, and the bottom part of their face covered under the bottom of the window. I also noticed another trail of footprints leading to the front door. They had to be Josh's. The woman was giving me a very creepy smile. I remember that feeling of my heart dropping for some reason. She waved me inside to come in and get out of the cold. I stopped dead in my tracks and screamed, "Josh!" but there was no response. The woman stopped smiling. She didn't expect me to do that. I also noticed that the other trail of footprints was doubled over. If it was Josh, his footprint turned around and headed back towards the woods. I then heard heavy footsteps from inside the house. They sounded like they were upstairs coming down. I started to run, and the woman screamed something at me or someone else that I didn't understand. I looked back once at the house, and that face that was upstairs at the window before was no longer there. I ran off the property back on the road, running through my previous footsteps. I started to hear my dad's whistling from up the hill, the he'd do to get my brother and I home at dinner time. When I made it back to our driveway, my dad and Josh were there already, having been on their way to get me. Before I could even try to explain what just happened, Josh was already telling me that there were people in the neighbor's house telling him to come inside. I said the same exact thing happened to me. So my dad went down there with some weapon in his hand. While we waited in the home with our mom, he came back after a long while and said that the front door was locked and no one was answering. So we went to another neighbor's house, and they knew the owners of the house and they called them. This part still gives me chills whenever my dad mentions what he was told. The owners of that house were not there that weekend. Nobody was supposed to be in the house. The cops were called and everything, and my brother and I did have to speak to one of the officers on scene to describe the woman. After that, we were no longer involved. According to my dad, the back door was unlocked and the house was investigated, which turned up nothing. For this reason, my parents took home any extra valuable things in fear of a break-in while we were gone. After that day, we steered clear of playing on that property, just from the creepiness factor of that memory alone. Thank God we didn't go in that house. I've been skiing for as long as I've been able to walk. My parents used to ski competitively. That's actually how they met. So it was really important to them that my siblings and I learned as early as possible. Fast forward about 20-odd years, and that's how old I am now. This story happened to me a few winters ago when I was 21 years old. I was a senior in college. Everyone knows the best skiing accessible to the Northeast is Vermont. It was going to be a trip like any other. It was me, Jaden, Rylan, and Amir. I can't remember for the life of me what mountain we were skiing that trip, as Jaden had booked the whole thing and Rylan was driving. What I do remember was that it was massive, with 7 ski lifts covering all the different peaks. If I had to guess, it was Killington. We skied nearly 2 full days, and I'm sure there were still trails we missed. That's how big it was. It was the second day. After skiing the day before, we had a pretty good grasp on the trails we enjoyed. So this day would mostly be about testing ourselves and pushing the limits as per tradition. I'd also be lying if I said we didn't have a handful of fireball shooters to liven things up. We were having an extremely enjoyable trip. The double blacks never got boring, and racing down each slope was its own little game. We had maybe an hour left until the lifts closed. We were all exhausted, but we knew as soon as we hit the road to head home, we'd instantly miss the mountain again. We were contemplating how we would end the trip at the top of the lift, when 2 girls without their helmets made their way over to us. Now this might sound a little odd to some people, but I wouldn't be doing this story justice if I left out this detail. The girls, one brunette and one blonde, were dropped at gorgeous, and I don't say that in any type of strange way. They were just objectively two of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in person. It was disarming. They introduced themselves as Taylor and Devin, and we started making small talk. They basically told us that they were bored because the mountain was full of older folk, which was actually something I'd remarked to my friends about the day before. So it made sense why they approached us, a group of young guys that seemed around their age. Devin seemed like a really seasoned skier, as she kept asking Amir all these technical questions about his skis. Him and Rylan actually owned their own expensive skis as opposed to renting like Jaden and I always did, which the girls seemed to be impressed with. Taylor made a comment about our shooters, and we jokingly told them that the alcohol unlocked our true ski potential or something dumb like that, which they found funny. To our surprise, Devin pulled out an unmarked bottle and taunted us, calling us bitches for sticking to a drink as tame as Fireball. The four of us welcomed the challenge and happily swigged some of their bottle, which I could tell sent Rylan a little over the edge. He tends to drink more than he could handle, so this wasn't too surprising. I made a note not to drink too much because something about this whole situation just rubbed me the wrong way. I still had trouble believing that these two girls would want anything to do with some dumb kids like us, especially since we were all wearing helmets, and our faces weren't exactly visible. Things were going really well, though. Amir was being his usual overly flirtatious self, but Taylor seemed like she was into it, so I didn't complain. I figured we were just going to spend the remainder of our time on the slope with these girls, which I didn't really mind too much. Hell, maybe they knew something we could do after the slopes closed. Just then, Devin asked us if we had skied down a trail called Devil's Forest, a name which I definitely didn't recognize. Our other friend, Chase, would have had the trail map memorized as he's literally a walking GPS, but he wasn't with us. We told them we hadn't, and they explained that it was a glade trail that's a little obscure and rarely open. For those who don't know, glades are basically trails that extend in between trees, so that you're skiing through a forest. We actually enjoyed skiing glades more than anything else, so this Devil's Forest trail piqued our interest. We told them we were game, and they motioned for us to follow them. We reached a choke point on our skis, and they told us to take them off, because we had to walk slightly uphill for a short while. I could tell we were in a relatively desolate part of the mountain, as the snow was perfectly fresh, and there was no one around. The thought of an adventure was invigorating though, so I thought nothing of it. Drunk and curious, we clipped our skis off and followed the girls up the mountain. Amir and Rylan ran ahead, presumably to flirt some more with them, and Jaden and I hung back a little bit to give some space. As we followed, I could tell Jaden looked a little wary, so I asked him what was on his mind. I like to think of us as the rational, level-headed ones in the group. Amira was too unpredictable and impulsive, and Rylan would follow a girl if she led him off a cliff. Jaden said that it was weird that this supposed trail would be inaccessible from a ski lift, which I agreed with. I had never had to walk uphill to reach a trail before. We agreed to just keep a keen eye on things. What could two girls? It was due to a group of 4 big guys anyway. They led us into the forest, and the terrain finally started leveling out. Jaden and I caught up with the group, and it was apparent that Rylan and Amir had both made considerable progress. Rylan had his arm around Devin, who was smiling and laughing. They pointed in the same direction we had been traveling, which had all of a sudden become a downward slope. I sighed, knowing this was another instance where we could have used Chase's help. He would have known exactly where we were and where this would have led. Jaden was still skeptical and asked the girls if they were sure that this was a real trail. They responded yes and told us that it would also take us right back to the lifts. Before I could say anything, Devin pulled the bottle out again and told us we had to finish it. Amir and Rylan happily took some hefty swigs, but when the bottle got around to Jaden, he said he was drunk enough. As soon as he spoke, I could have sworn Devin's smile became a really angry scowl for a split second, but by the time I blinked, she was smiling again. I must have been the only one to notice because I looked around at my friends and their expressions were all normal. She put on a seductive smile and batted her eyes at Jaden, asking him nicely, He reluctantly grabbed the bottle if just to shut her up. By the time it got to me, I put the bottle up to my mouth but didn't actually drink. Everything about this encounter was triggering alarm bells suddenly in my head. I handed the bottle back to Devin, who put it away. I noted that neither another girl drank this time around. It dawned on me that I hadn't seen either one of them drink anything this whole time. I checked my phone half an hour until the lifts closed. I tried to come up with some excuse for why we couldn't ski this trail, saying that we wouldn't have enough time to get back up and down the mountain to where we had parked. The girls insisted that we'd have enough time and that the lifts were connected on the bottom anyway. Then, without warning, they told us that we were wasting too much time and took off toward the slope, telling us to follow them if we could. Amir and Rylan immediately followed, clearly hoping for a favorable outcome at the bottom. Jaden and I obviously didn't want to, but figured we had no choice but to follow. So that's what we did. I let Jaden lead the way because, after all, this was still a challenging-looking slope, and skiing in the forest is no joke. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but when we made it to the bottom, I was relieved. The four of them were at the bottom of the slope, laughing and flirting like they had been before. Jaden and I caught up with the group, but something was wrong. There wasn't a lift in sight. We were still surrounded by forest on all sides. I sternly asked the girls where the lift was, and they told me to stop worrying and that it was close by. Then they said they'd take us there in a few minutes. I relaxed a little, assuming that I was worried this whole time about nothing. As I was rubbing my eyes, I heard a distinct thump in the snow. I opened them to see Rylan, who was literally passed out on his back in the snow. The girls laughed, calling him a lightweight, but I could tell it was more serious than that. Before I could even react, Amir slumped over too, started freaking out, and I rushed over to them, unclipping my skis. I thanked my lucky stars that they seemed to be breathing normally, but I was beyond horrified. Jaden took a step towards the girls, asking them what the hell was going on. They seemed genuinely shocked, saying they have no idea what was wrong. Jaden took another step before he too passed out in the snow. I stared in shock, still trying to wrap my head around the gravity of the situation. I just couldn't fathom that this was happening to us. My head started spinning and I was sure that I was next. The girls had stopped pretending by now, and they looked at me like they were waiting for me to pass out. I felt myself getting dizzy, so I sat down in the snow, even though I wanted to stay on my feet. I demanded to know what they had given us. They didn't respond or even move that matter. I yelled at them over and over again, but they still didn't react. I wanted to get up, but I quite literally couldn't stand. I didn't pass out, though. I kept my eyes open the whole time. Eventually, Taylor turned to Devin and said something along the lines of, "He must have not drank enough." This is gonna sound a little weird, but bear with me. Every winter, my friends Kyle, Ricky, and I have this little tradition of walking out onto this frozen lake a few towns over. It's not some grand event or anything. We just do it for fun. There's something about the vibe of being out there on the ice, surrounded by the quiet stillness that feels almost otherworldly. It's just one of those simple things I've always enjoyed. Call us weird, but we can never get enough of the serenity. If you've ever been out in nature by yourself, with the only sound being the gentle pattern of snowflakes, you know what I'm talking about. It feels like you've got a piece of nature all to yourself. The photos always turn out great too, which is a huge plus for a couple of edgy guys like us. This happened this past winter. It's April as I'm writing this, so about 4 months ago now. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry, none of us fell through the ice. That's not what this story is about. It was snowing pretty heavily that night, which was the main reason we decided to go. It had been consistently below freezing for a couple of weeks too, so we were relatively confident the lake was completely frozen over. I'd personally take winter over summer any day of the week. I bet all my friends would agree. There are about a million reasons why, but one of them is as simple as the snowfall itself. First of all, it's just pretty. What I like most about it, though, is that you'll never find yourself in complete darkness. Even after sunset, the world isn't entirely dark. The light reflecting off the white snow blends day and night. So you're left with this really surreal feeling that doesn't arise from anything else. The moon was also pretty full that night, So that feeling was amplified. Kyle was driving that night. He had a pickup that handled pretty well in the snow. So we just played it safe and let him drive, even though Ricky was usually the one who chauffeured us around. The lake itself is surrounded by a thin forest, so we couldn't actually drive all the way to the water's edge. I don't think forest is the right word. It's really just a cluster of sparsely scattered trees, but it's more than enough to prevent a car from driving through. We parked in a nearby lot and got out of the car. It was freezing out. The three of us bundled up and walked toward the lake. I didn't smoke at the time. I still don't, but Ricky and Kyle both do. So they lit a couple of cigarettes as we walked. I think it was after midnight, but I can't say for sure. All I remember is that there wasn't a soul out there. Not an animal, not a person. Nothing. No movement whatsoever besides the three of us. We reached the lake, and as we anticipated, it seemed completely frozen over. The three of us were laughing about something stupid when Kyle picked up a small boulder and chucked it onto the ice. Testing its integrity, it didn't even crack. So we took that as an indication to make our way towards the middle of the lake. We obviously didn't go super far on the ice. That would have been careless, but we did venture a decent ways away from the ledge. We were maybe 100 feet beat out when something caught our attention. On the far side of the lake, near the edge where the trees bordered the ice, something big and dark was moving. We stopped talking immediately. We just stopped in our tracks watching. Whatever it was large, hunched over and moving slowly toward the lake. Finally, we realized what we were looking at. It was a bear. Ricky was the first to say something. He whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do is draw its attention. We stood there frozen, not even daring to breathe too loudly. But then as the figure moved closer, something felt off. But the way it walked wasn't quite right. Too upright, too human. It also looked like there was something dragging behind it. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen. And that's when it straightened up completely, and we realized the truth all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person wearing some bear suit. Kyle said, "What the hell?" in a low voice, and I was thinking the same exact thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in a generic sense, but if you had been there, you would have been terrified too. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know if I was more afraid or confused, but something told me to stay quiet. The figure kept moving toward the ice, dragging something behind him. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The snow blurred the details, but as he got closer, I realized he was holding a rope that was attached to the thing he was dragging. And a few moments later, we could see it more clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a smaller-sized garbage bag if they even made those. Either way, it was chilling. We stood there unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky and Kyle were too keen on turning around and leaving, either because neither one of them flinched. I probably wouldn't have left right then, even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any stranger, the man unzipped and stepped out of the bear suit. Seeing him as a person didn't make things any better. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something unsettling about him. We watched as he bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, but I couldn't tell from so far away. Then the sound started. He knelt down holding what looked like a rock and began repeatedly slamming it into the ice. So we took that as an indication to make our way towards the middle of the lake. We obviously didn't go super far on the ice. That would have been careless, but we did venture a decent ways away from the ledge. We were maybe 100 feet beat out when something caught our attention. On the far side of the lake, near the edge where the trees bordered the ice, something big and dark was moving. We stopped talking immediately. We just stopped in our tracks watching. Whatever it was large, hunched over and moving slowly toward the lake. Finally, we realized what we were looking at. It was a bear. Ricky was the first to say something. He whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do is draw its attention. We stood there frozen, not even daring to breathe too loudly. But then as the figure moved closer, something felt off. But the way it walked wasn't quite right. Too upright, too human. It also looked like there was something dragging behind it. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen. And that's when it straightened up completely, and we realized the truth all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person wearing some bear suit. Kyle said, "What the hell?" in a low voice, and I was thinking the same exact thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in a generic sense, but if you had been there, you would have been terrified too. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know if I was more afraid or confused, but something told me to stay quiet. The figure kept moving toward the ice, dragging something behind him. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The snow blurred the details, but as he got closer, I realized he was holding a rope that was attached to the thing he was dragging. And a few moments later, we could see it more clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a smaller-sized garbage bag if they even made those. Either way, it was chilling. We stood there unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky and Kyle were too keen on turning around and leaving, either because neither one of them flinched. I probably wouldn't have left right then, even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any stranger, the man unzipped and stepped out of the bear suit. Seeing him as a person didn't make things any better. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something unsettling about him. We watched as he bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, but I couldn't tell from so far away. Then the sound started. He knelt down holding what looked like a rock and began repeatedly slamming it into the ice. This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described as the place where you'd feel fine, leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, a lightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something on a Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. Said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around again, facing away from the house. This time I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son, Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then one evening, I looked out the window and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block. But that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the it was every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statues somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer nearby, which I guess was some consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window pointing outside. I looked and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in a strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out in my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them, though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last withdrawal. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happens that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick because those people never returned. And we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in the same house and never got an explanation for what happened. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them. So that's what we did. We don't have kids and she stopped working ages ago, so she was relatively amenable to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so bouncing around isn't much of a problem for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico. We've both been rural people all our lives, so it wasn't that drastic of a lifestyle change. That was about 3 months ago, give or take. We found a fantastic deal on a place way out in the country. The house is honestly bigger than we really need, especially since it's just the two of us and our black lab Lola. But honestly, we figured we'd make use out of the extra space. Maybe even host some of the friends we'd make. We'd been settled in for a few months when I started noticing something odd. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house would still have power. After this happened once or twice, I knew exactly what the problem was. Like I said, I'm literally an electrician, so this stuff is my bread and butter. I figured it would be an easy fix. Just a matter of rearranging some of the load on the breaker, which in all likelihood was downstairs. Times like those make me happy that I'm the type of guy who knows how to fix things. To be honest, I hadn't spent that much time in the basement since we moved in. I didn't really have a reason to. We looked it over briefly when the realtor showed us the place, but I didn't pay much attention. Come to think of it, I don't think I'd been in there one time since then. Anyway, I walked down the stairs and started looking around for the main breaker. The basement was pretty cluttered, and definitely not the type of space that could be easily used. It looked more like a storage room than a basement. Eventually, I figured out where the main was and started futzing around. After about 10 minutes, I realized where the load imbalance was and told myself I'd rewire it when I had more time. At that point, I was about to go upstairs when curiosity got the better of me. I figured since I was down in the basement already, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have a look around. After all, this is my house, and it was honestly a little strange that I didn't know every square inch of it. Like I said, most of it was filled with old furniture and a bunch of junk. There wasn't anything particularly interesting down there, and I eventually concluded that trying to transform it to a usable space would be way too much of a hassle. That's when I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old wooden chairs was a large metal door. It was strange because this wasn't just any door. It looked industrial grade. It was also a lot taller than most normal doors would be, and it seemed pretty thick too. I walked over to it and my suspicions were confirmed. It looked like the type of door you'd see securing a walk-in safe or some panic room. My first thought was maybe it was a tornado shelter or storm room or something. But that would be a weird surprise. You'd think the realtor would have mentioned a feature like that. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I immediately went upstairs and started rummaging through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left behind in case we locked ourselves out or something, but none of them worked on the door. I must have tried like 15 keys or something, but no luck. I eventually told Taylor about it, and she was just as curious about it as I was. I'm still not sure how, but she worked her magic, and we were able to get in contact with the previous owners. It was that exact phone call that took me from curious about the situation to downright concerned. They were a little odd on the phone and would pause every so often, like they were thinking carefully about what they were saying, or trying not to say too much. Part of me wishes I had recorded the conversation. But hindsight is 20/20. When I asked about the door, they got quiet. Eventually, the wife said it was just the safe room in case of a tornado. I told her that was great, but we were unable to use it since it was locked. After another pause, she claimed they'd lost the key and told us to just ignore it. I thought that was extremely unlikely since they had literally left us keys to random doors that we'd probably never need to lock. The way she said it gave me a really bad feeling in my gut, too, but there was nothing I could do. We ended up hanging up almost immediately after that, as they were definitely not trying to make small talk. Taylor, my mother, tried to laugh it off, told me I was overthinking it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the course of the next few weeks, I would occasionally wander down the stairs and just stare at that door, wondering what could be inside. I tried everything I could think of to open it, even some tricks I'd picked up from work, but it was no use. The lock was solid. I ended up giving up for about a week, but the curiosity ultimately got the better of me. Fast forward to 2 days ago when things took a wild turn. After, in my wife's wishes, I decided to hire a locksmith. He came over, and I let him do his thing down there. After about 30 minutes, I went downstairs to check on him. He told me that the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I was worried he wouldn't be able to get it open, but to my surprise, he actually managed to crack it after another half hour. I wish he hadn't. Inside, the room was set up like some shrine. There were old black and white photographs on the walls, all covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair just facing the wall. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time sitting there, just staring at nothing. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and it smelled stale and gross. Then I noticed the trash, empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization smacked me in the face. Someone had actually been staying down there, and not that long ago. I was dumbfounded. I didn't think the situation could get much worse. But of course, that's what happened. As I was trying to take it all in, I noticed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was small and half hidden by the minimal light, but it was there. I opened it and realized it led to a set of stairs that led to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like such an idiot. I hadn't even had the foresight to check the cellar door when we moved, since I just assumed it led to the basement. In all the time we'd lived here, I had never even opened it. My bewilderment at the whole thing soon became terror. Someone had literally been living in my house for who knows how long. Things started clicking in my brain. Since moving in, my wife and I had noticed a few weird things that we couldn't explain. Most of the time, it was just things going missing. Until that point, I had just assumed my wife had misplaced things, which she did have a tendency to do. This discovery changed everything, though. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought a dozen times in my head before I could fully wrap my mind around what was going on. I didn't know who had been in there or why, but I knew I didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number, or they just didn't want to deal with it. Taylor was freaked out, and I was too. That night, I took some heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. I found a heavy-duty looking chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. I didn't care what it took. There was no way I was letting someone sneak back in through that door. The police came and took down a full report before leaving, telling us they'd do their best to try and get in contact with previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was horrified and said she'd assist the police in any way she could. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. There was a loud bang on the front door. Lola shot up, barking like crazy, and we both froze. Neither of us moved, just staring at each other, listening. After a few minutes, the banging stopped. But then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor held on to Lola, and I went to look out the window. Taylor begged me not to, but I was furious at that point. In my mind, I was preparing to fight whoever was out there. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and yanked the curtains away from the window, but I couldn't see a thing. We thought it was over. Taylor wanted me to call the police, but there was a little part of me that wanted to handle this myself. I knew the police would scare them away and call it pettiness, but I wanted to make sure whoever was out there got caught. I told her if one more thing happened, I'd call. But then from downstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to see there were two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. It was then that I called the police, who showed up not long after. They searched the house and the basement, but there was no sign of forced entry into the storm room. They didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there was angry when they realized. They were locked out and decided to come back and scare us. I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar, and when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it had something to do with management, being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular. Even though I personally don't think it's anything super special, the atmosphere is lively those nights with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests, but that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rooty environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips, which sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila, shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered, he was the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour, I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either. No food, and definitely not any drinks I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each. They were both fixated at the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slant, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone, or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached, neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just staring at me, and shook his head once firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker, Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me. But on the inside, though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory. But like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street, there were 2 dark figures standing under a lone streetlight. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car door, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any explanation. I don't think I ever will. Breakups are tough, even when you know they're for the best. So I'd been trying to keep myself together after splitting up with my boyfriend of 2.5 years. I don't really want to get into it. It wasn't messy or dramatic. We just weren't right for each other anymore, but that didn't make it any easier. Some days it felt like everything reminded me of him. I'd been forcing myself to stick to no contact, telling myself that it was the healthiest way for both of us to move on. It was hard though, really hard. One of the things I missed most about us was playing pool together. It was our thing. I'm a pretty decent player, definitely better than average. But my ex, he was incredible on his good days. He could pull off trick shots like it was nothing. 1 rail, 2 rail banks, kicks, combinations. I'm pretty sure he was even learning a standard mess. We each had pool tables at home, but obviously we're young, and staying inside every night wasn't exactly ideal. When we did go out, we always made sure that wherever we were going, usually a bar had some pool tables. We hated crowded bars with long waits for tables and screaming patrons, though, so the places we went were quieter, usually attracting an older crowd. Dive bars with old scuffed tables and sticky floors were our sweet spot. Obviously, you can't expect to find a regulation table in pristine condition at any bar, but the dive bars were definitely a better shout than rowdy college bars. We were usually the youngest people there, but we didn't care. At that point in our relationship, we had grown somewhat bored of the typical college, let's get plastered every night mentality. Plus, even though I'm shy, my ex was pretty charismatic and would get along with anyone. Us not being total newbies at pool didn't hurt either. A few weeks ago, I found myself missing that part of my life more than usual. It was a random Wednesday though, so none of my friends were free. I didn't want to sit around the house feeling sorry for myself anymore, so I decided to head out to one of the bars we used to go to. I told myself it wasn't about nostalgia, that I just needed to get out. Believe me, I'm not the type of person, nor do I usually have the confidence to go out myself. But I was feeling some type of way that night. The bar was exactly the same as I remembered. Dim lighting, worn-out stools, a jukebox in the corner. The familiarity was comforting, but it also stung. The memories came flooding back, and I almost turned around and left right then, but I forced myself to stay. After grabbing a few drinks, I wandered over to one of the pool tables and started idly chalking a cue. I'm not really sure what I was planning on doing there. Playing alone would have been a little odd. Luckily, my question was answered because a guy walked over. He was maybe in his mid-20s, the only person in the room even close to my age. He leaned against the table and asked if I was up for a game. I nodded and told him to rack him up. He put some money in the slot and started racking the... I laughed to myself as he racked them wrong, but I didn't say anything. We played a few rounds, and I started to relax. He wasn't bad, not as good as my ex, but not terrible. I wasn't going easy on him though. I won every rack we played. We chatted as we played, and he even bought me a couple of drinks. He was friendly enough, but it quickly became clear he wasn't the brightest guy in the world. I like sharp and quick-witted guys who can hold their own in a conversation. To this guy, not so much. Still, I didn't mind. It felt good to just play and talk and not overthink things for once. I was having a good time. After the fourth game, he popped the question, asking if I wanted to go back to his place. The question caught me off guard, but I guess I couldn't have been too shocked. I froze for a second before shaking my head. I tried to make it playful, saying he'd need a second date for that. In all honesty, I just didn't want to move so quickly. I guess I wouldn't have been totally opposed to taking things further with him. But a random Wednesday night wasn't the time for that. I guess I didn't do a good job turning him down. Though because his entire demeanor changed, his smile dropped and he literally started scowling at me. I was not prepared for what happened next. He said, "Are you serious?" I grabbed my wrist, saying something about spending all that money on those drinks. Before I could respond, he snatched my purse too. I had never been in a situation like that. So instead of screaming or fighting, I just froze up. Even though we were in a public place, I was still terrified. Luckily, a couple of older guys at the bar noticed what was happening and stepped in. I'm honestly not sure what I would have done had they not. One of them told the guy to let me go. The guy glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and threw my purse back onto the table before storming right out of the bar. My heart was still racing, and I thanked those guys profusely for helping me out. That was it for me, though. I called an Uber and left the bar. Still shocked and trying to process what had just happened, I decided to close my eyes in the Uber. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is the Uber driver gently waking me up. We were parked across the street from my house. I thanked him, got out of the car, and started walking toward the door. As I rummaged through my bag for my keys, I impulsively checked my phone for the first time since leaving bar. That's when I saw it, that god-awful notification. AirTag found moving with you. I nearly dropped my phone. My hands started to shake as I rummaged through my purse, tossing aside my wallet and makeup until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. I pulled it out and stared in disbelief. There was literally an AirTag in my bag. A wave of panic hit me, way worse than what I was feeling earlier. I was still standing in the middle of the street, so I threw it on the ground and stomped on it a bunch of times until I was sure it was broken. I fought back a scream and started breathing heavily. The cold wasn't helping. I needed to get inside. I looked around frantically, but the street was completely empty. Whoever had planted the AirTag, probably that guy from the bar, would know exactly where I was. Maybe not my exact house, but the street for sure. The houses on my street are large and spaced out, so he'd definitely be able to narrow it down. I grabbed my purse and sprinted to the back door, fumbling with the lock before finally getting inside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was safe, but I couldn't stop shaking. I walked up to my room, wondering how I had gotten myself into this mess. Normally, I'm asleep by 10 saksu and out cold for 9 or 10 hours, but there was no way I was going to sleep that night. I looked out my bedroom window, thinking maybe the scenery would lull me to sleep or something. As I was looking out the window mindlessly, I noticed an old beat-up Lincoln drive slowly past my house. Nothing too unusual, but it was late for cars to be driving on a residential road. But then it came back from the opposite direction, and I knew something was wrong. It passed even slower the second time, like the driver was scanning the houses. I didn't want to face the reality of the situation, but when it passed a third time, I had no choice. It was the guy. It had to be. He was trying to find my house. I wanted to scream again. The next time the car passed, the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't want that guy to know he was in the right area. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I was so scared and couldn't think straight. The next time the car passed, the driver's hand was hanging out of the window, holding something. It looked like a knife. And then, instead of driving past, the car stopped in the middle of the road, right across from my house. I ducked down, my heart beating a million beats a minute again. I stayed there, crouched below the window, too terrified to move. By the time I looked up, the car was gone. I waited for what must have been an hour, but it didn't come back. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad scolded me for not calling the police, but I told him I was too scared to. He called a buddy of his, a police chief, to ask for advice. His friend said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence, or the car's plate number, which I hadn't been able to see. His friend told us to call the police immediately should we ever see that car again. I didn't leave the house for days. Even now, I'm really scared that he's waiting somewhere, and he's going to see me enter or exit my house again. I haven't seen the car since though, so maybe the nightmare is over. I don't have the most exciting life, but it's comfortable. I'm 40, single, no kids. Some people might find that depressing, but honestly, I don't mind. I've got a steady job, a decent house, and no one to answer to but myself. I work as a bartender at a high-end luxury rooftop in a neighboring town, catering to the clientele who think regular bars are beneath them. I don't live anywhere near that level of luxury myself. My place is in a pretty middle-of-the-pack neighborhood, about 20 minutes away, but working there has its perks. The tips are amazing. People in that area aren't shy about throwing money around, and the rotating crowd keeps things interesting. Since the bar is upscale, we don't have the typical regulars you find in a dive. I like that. I never quite liked how close some customers would get with me or any other bartender for that matter. Maybe that's just me though. I like to keep to myself. I should probably mention that my name's Kevin. That'll be important later. It was a Friday night, our busiest night. The place was packed as usual, with groups of friends clinking glasses, couples on date nights, and a few folks who probably wandered in just to feel important. I always like playing a mental game with my patrons. I try to figure out which ones are pretending to be something they're not. You can tell a lot about people by the way they order a drink. The ones who ask for complicated coffee hotels are usually trying to impress someone. The ones who order a whiskey neat, they've had a day. I had my eye on a couple at the end of the bar who were down to their last sips of wine. It's always better to offer a refill before they wave you down. I was in my groove, mixing drinks and chatting with customers when I noticed someone walk in who definitely looked out of place. I clocked the guy immediately. He was clenching his teeth and scowling like he was furious. He had jet black hair that wasn't combed and sat like a bird's nest on his forehead. He was wearing a blank black hoodie under a faded leather jacket, which looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were stains all over it, but none of that was as unsettling as his face. Like I said, he just looked so angry. He made a sea line for the bar, but he didn't sit down. He just stood there staring at me. I wondered to myself how he had gotten past the doorman in the lobby. I cleared my throat and asked if I could get him something to drink, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the weird vibe he was giving off. He didn't answer right away, which was strange. He just kept glaring at me like he was getting ready to swing. Finally, he muttered that he wanted a double shot of Jaeger. I nodded, grabbed a glass and poured the shot. Jaeger isn't a drink we pour often here. Most of our patrons are likely to ask for something a little higher quality. But hey, if someone wants Jaeger, I'm not about to question their taste. I set the glass in front of him and moved on to serve a few other patrons. When I came back to charge him, he tossed crumpled cash onto the counter. That also threw me off. Hardly anyone pays in cash at this place. Again though, it wasn't my place to judge. The guy didn't say anything as I rang him up, and I was ready to move on when he spoke again. I still remember his exact words. "I knew I'd find you here, Kevin." I froze. My eyes snapped to his as I scrabbled to process what he just said. I put the glass in my hand down and demanded to know how he knew I didn't want to make a scene, so I kept my voice low, but I hoped he got the gist of how serious I was. He didn't answer my question, just stared at me with the same angry intensity. Finally, he said, "I know what you did." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked towards the elevators. I wanted to yell something or chase after him, but I decided against it. I was on the clock. I couldn't just neglect my job. Instead, I just stood there for a moment, completely thrown off. I was honest to God, confused out of my mind. I didn't recognize him in the slightest. I couldn't think of anything I had done that would warrant such a cryptic statement. I'm no saint, but I don't go around making enemies. It put me in a sour mood for the rest of the night. When my shift finally ended, I drove home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier. I racked my brain for literally any explanation that made sense, but couldn't think of any. By the I ended up going to bed, I was still relatively unsettled by the whole thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up randomly. I wasn't really sure what woke me up, as I didn't have to go to the bathroom. And I'm usually the type of person to sleep through the night. I didn't hear or see anything, but something felt off. Without moving, I kept my eyes open, waiting for them to adjust to the darkness. After about a minute, I saw something that gave me an adrenaline rush of fear. There was a dark mass in the corner of my room, next to the door. It was just standing there, but I was 100% sure it was something that didn't belong in my room. I felt my heart start to race, but I forced myself to stay still, pretending to still be asleep. Someone was in my room. I repeated that thought to myself like 6 times before truly processing it. I knew I had to do something. I counted silently to 3, and in one quick motion I sprung out of bed, screaming like a crazy person. I was prepared for a fight, but the figure didn't come toward me. Instead, he bolted for the door. As he moved, I heard something clatter to the floor. I chased after him through my house, but by the time I reached the front door, it was wide open, and whoever had been in my room was gone. I wanted to run out into the yard to look for him, but I was worried that I'd be walking directly into a trap. Instead, I made what I still think is the smart decision and slammed the door shut and locked it. I thought back to the clatter I had heard earlier in room. I walked back to my bedroom, turned on the light, and froze. In the corner of the room, there was a knife just laying there on the floor. It was one of mine taken from the kitchen. I felt sick. Whoever I had just chased was planning to hurt me, possibly kill me. I called the police right after that, and they quickly arrived and searched both my house and my yard, but found nothing. I gave a description of the man from the bar, and the police got the video footage from my bar. But they haven't been able to find him yet because I heard anything. The thing that freaks me out the most is that I know for a fact I had locked all my doors that night. I locked them every night. During their search, though, the police were never able to figure out how that man entered my house. None of the windows were broken or unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry. To this day, I still have no idea how he got inside. I haven't seen him since. But I would be lying if I said I don't think about this encounter often. I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar. And when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it had something to do with management. Being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular, even though I personally don't think it's anything super special. The atmosphere is lively those nights with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests. But that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rootier environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips, which sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila, shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered, he was the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour, I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either. No food and definitely not any drinks I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each. They were both fixated at the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slant, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone, or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached, neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just staring at me, and shook his head once firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker, Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me. But on the inside, though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory. But like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street, there were 2 dark figures standing under a lone streetlight. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car door, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any explanation. I don't think I ever will. In 2024, I was just 13 years old. It was a quiet Friday evening, and I was sitting on the couch in our living room watching an old rerun of some cartoon I didn't really care about. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the house, blending with the hum of the TV. My mom was upstairs in the bathroom, getting ready for bed. She always took her time, and I knew better than to bother her during her routine. A sudden knock at the front door broke the peaceful monotony's company of the night. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was enough to startle me. I hesitated, staring at the door. Who would visit us this late? I got up, my feet dragging against the carpet as I moved toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a familiar face, Mr. Dalvin, my dad's old friend. His gray hair was damp from the rain and his expression was grave. My chest tightened. Something wasn't right. I opened the door. "Hi, Mr. Dalvin," I said, my voice shaky. "Hey, kid," he replied, his voice low and serious. "I need to talk to your mom. Your dad, he's been in an accident. He's in the hospital." My stomach dropped. "Wait here," I mumbled, bolting upstairs to get my mom. I called out to her, barely able to form the words. She rushed out of the bathroom, still wrapping her robe around herself, and hurried down to meet Mr. Dalvin. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching as he explained everything to her. She gasped, covering her mouth with one hand. It's a year later, we were in Mr. Dalvin's car, speeding through the rain-slick streets toward the hospital. The whole ride, my mom kept asking questions, but his answers were short. All I could gather was that my dad's condition was serious, and he was still in surgery. My hands gripped the seatbelt tightly, my heart pounding. When we arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit me immediately. The lights were too bright, the walls too white. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through their faces, set in expressions of focus. We were directed to a waiting area outside the operating theater. My mom sat down, clutching her purse, her face pale and tense. I sat beside her, feeling completely out of place. The clock on the wall seemed to tick her with every passing second. Around 1 a.m., exhaustion took over. My mom's head was nodding as she fought to stay awake. I, on the other hand, was restless. Sitting still felt impossible, so I decided to explore the hospital. "I'll just walk around a bit," I told her. She barely responded, lost in her worry. The hallways of the hospital were dimly lit and eerily quiet at that hour. The further I wandered, the less familiar everything became. It was like the walls stretched endlessly, every a turn leading to another identical corridor. My sneakers squeaked against the tiled floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Then I felt it, a presence. Someone was behind me. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse. A man stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette barely visible under the faint glow of the overhead lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. My breath quickened. I kept walking, quickening my pace, hoping I was imagining things. But when I glanced back again, he was closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to remember the way back to the waiting area. But every hallway looked the same. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Up ahead, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Without thinking, waking, I slipped inside and quietly shut the door behind me. My eyes adjusted to the dim room and I realized where I was. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one labeled with a small tag. A cold chill settled over me. I didn't know much about hospitals, but even at 13 I understood where I was. The morgue, I backed away from the drawers, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a loud knock shattered the silence. I froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, but this time I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from one of the drawers. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. As I stared at the row of metal compartments, the knock sounded again, louder this time. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle of the drawer. Just as I was about to open it, a voice behind me made me jump. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" I spun around to see a man in a white coat, a doctor. His face was stern, but his eyes held a hint of curiosity. There was a knock," I stammered, pointing at the drawer. He raised an eyebrow. "A knock from a morgue drawer?" He didn't wait for my answer before stepping past me and opening the drawers one by one. I watched in horror as each drawer revealed what I already feared. Pale, lifeless bodies. My stomach churned and I took a step back, unable to process what I was seeing. "See? Nothing here but the deceased," the doctor said, his tone dismissive. But before I could respond, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the room. I turned toward the door, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped and the door creaked open slightly. Standing there was the same man who had been following me. His face was shadowed, but his intent was clear. The man's footsteps echoed behind me as I ran, my lungs burning with every breath. I turned corner after corner, hoping to lose him. But the endless hallways seemed to loop back on themselves. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I heard a familiar voice. "Honey, where are you?" It was my mom. Her voice was like a lifeline, pulling me out of the nightmare. I sprinted toward the sound, tears streaming down my face. When I reached her, I collapsed into her arms, sobbing. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I turned to point at the man, but he was gone. The hallway was empty. Later, when I calmed down, I told my mom everything. She was skeptical, but concerned enough to report it to the hospital staff. Security searched the premises, but found no one matching the description of the man who had followed me. The next morning, we spoke to the same doctor I had met in the morgue. When I told him about the knocking sound, he looked at me with a mix of confusion and pity. "You must have been dreaming," he said. "There's no way anyone could knock from inside one of those drawers." I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. To this day, I can still hear that knock echoing in my mind. And as for the man who followed me, he was never caught. Sometimes late at night, I wonder who he was and what he wanted. But most of all, I wonder about that sound in the morgue. Was it just my imagination, or was it something far worse? I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but there's something about that night that I can't explain. Something that keeps me awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again. It all started when my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned Waverly Hills Sanatorium. You've probably heard of it. It's one of the most haunted places in America. I know, cliché, right? But we weren't there for ghost stories. We were there for content. My best friend Kyle had this idea to start a YouTube channel. Ghost Hunters in the Dark, he called it. He thought it would blow up if we captured anything spooky. Then there was Mike, the skeptic in our group, and me, the one stuck somewhere in between. I didn't think we'd see anything, but I was curious enough to try. The sanatorium loomed over us like a black hole, swallowing up all the light from the full moon. Its windows were shattered, and the front doors hung open like a gaping mouth. Kyle was the most excited, bouncing with his camera in hand. Mike stayed quiet, fidgeting with his flashlight. "We'll cover more ground if we split up," Kyle suggested once we were inside. I didn't like the idea, but the building was massive. With long, winding hallways and endless rooms, it felt like a maze designed to keep you lost. Kyle argued that we could always call each other if something happened. And reluctantly, we agreed. I took the west hallway where the air felt heavy and cold. My footsteps echoed, each sound bouncing back to me from the empty walls. The rooms I passed were mostly the same: peeling paint, overturned furniture, broken glass. Some still had rusted hospital beds, with torn mattresses as the ghosts of patients lingered there. Now and then I thought I heard something faint, a whisper, a scuffle of feet. But when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. My flashlight flickered and I tapped it nervously. Meanwhile, Kyle and Mike explored their hallways. Over the walkie-talkie, Kyle's voice crackled with updates about old operating rooms and graffiti-covered walls. Mike stayed quieter, muttering occasionally about how this was all a waste of time. I had just turned a corner when Kyle's voice broke through the static. "Guys, come to me." Now his tone wasn't playful anymore. It was sharp and tense. "Where are you?" Mike asked, his voice equally uneasy. "East hallway near the central staircase," Kyle replied. I started moving fast, the beam of my flashlight bobbing along the cracked tiles. I reached the staircase at the same time as Mike. Kyle was standing in the middle of the hall, his flashlight aimed at the ground. "What is it?" Mike asked out of breath. Kyle didn't answer right away. He just pointed. There on the floor was a white sheet. At first I thought it was just trash, but it wasn't crumpled like trash usually is. It was smooth, and the way it rose slightly in the middle, it looked like something was underneath. I felt a lump in my throat. "Is someone—" I didn't finish the sentence. Kyle nodded. "I think so. I thought it was just a blanket at first. But it's too neat, and it's not moving." Mike scoffed, trying to hide his fear. "Probably a homeless guy sleeping. Let's just leave." But Kyle shook his head. "We need to check. What if they're hurt?" Neither of us argued. Kyle was always the brave one. Kyle knelt next to the sheet, his flashlight still trained on it. His hand hovered over the edge. "Stay back," he said. I don't know why, but I grabbed Mike's arm, squeezing hard. There was something wrong about that sheet, something I couldn't put into words. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then reached out. He pinched the edge of the cloth between his fingers and started to lift it. That's when he screamed. It wasn't a startled yell or a shout for attention. It was the scream that curdles your blood raw and primal. He shot to his feet, dropping the flashlight. And before I could process what was happening, he was running. Mike and I didn't wait to ask questions. We bolted after him, our footsteps pounding through the dark, our breath ragged. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. Kyle was pacing, his hands shaking. "What did you see?" Mike demanded. Kyle didn't look at us right away. His eyes were wide, staring at the ground. Finally, he whispered. There were eyes under the sheet, glowing bright yellow, staring right at me. Mike and I exchanged a look, but neither of us spoke. "We need to call the cops," Kyle said. "What if it's a body or someone dangerous?" The police arrived about 20 minutes later. We led them to the spot, but when we got there, the sheet was gone. The officers searched the area, but there was nothing. No sheet, no body, no glowing eyes, just an empty hallway. They took our statements, though I could tell they didn't believe us. One of them, an older guy with a tired face, pulled me aside. "You know," he said, "there's a story about this place. They say some of the patients never left. Maybe you kids should stay away." Later that night, after we'd gone home, we reviewed the footage. Kyle's camera had been rolling the whole time. We fast-forwarded to the part where he approached the sheet. The video showed Kyle kneeling, his hand reaching out, and then static. When the image returned, the camera was on the ground, pointing at our retreating feet. We never uploaded the video. We never went back to the sanatorium either. Kyle stopped talking about glowing eyes after a while, but I know he still sees them in his nightmares. Care facility. It was interesting to think about how many years it had been serving the community in different ways. New modern wings were built, and there was also a section with low care units. These units looked like single-level cabins nestled in a lovely garden setting. They were designed for people who could still take care of themselves, but needed to be nearby in case they required medical help. Some of the original old buildings were still being used, and they had many places where cold drafts came indoors that were hard to open, and other problems that needed attention. One of the most interesting things was a door that could lock all by itself. Then, just a few seconds later, it would unlock again, and there was no one nearby to in the lock. It was quite mysterious and made people wonder how it happened. So my wife would get a ride to work and back, home with a neighbor who worked at the same place. However, on Fridays, that neighbor would finish her work around lunchtime. To make sure my wife could continue working a full day, I would drive to pick her up after her shift. The drive took about 40 minutes each way, allowing me to be there for her when she finished her work. Since the traffic could be very unpredictable, I always made sure to leave an hour early to reach my destination on time. I would sit patiently outside the cozy brick cottage that served as an office, resting on a weathered old church pew. Some of the older people living in the low-care units would stroll around the lovely grounds, which were set in a beautiful rural area. As they walked, they would greet everyone with a friendly hello. After a few weeks, I got to know Ken better. He was in his 80s and lived in a low-care facility where he received assistance with daily activities. He faced some ongoing problems that made him spend several days in the hospital. After that, he would return home for a few weeks to rest and recover. He carefully planned my routine, and every Friday, he would be sitting on that familiar church pew, patiently waiting for me to arrive. I liked having a conversation with him. It was nice to share thoughts and ideas. He had a wealth of life experiences and had seen and done many things during his younger years. He loved to share those stories, and I found so much joy in listening to every single one of them. Ken owned a classic Toyota Celica from the 1980s. It was a stylish car that turned heads wherever he drove it. The sleek lines and vibrant color made it stand out on the road, and Ken loved the way it felt to be behind the wheel of such a memorable vehicle. He could no longer drive the car, but he felt a strong reluctance to part with it. Whenever his family visited him, he would ask them to take him for a ride in it. He often asked me to take him out for a drive, but I hardly knew him at all. The thought of driving a car that I wasn't familiar with made me feel uneasy, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. In addition, I had just about 20 minutes left before I would be heading out on my journey. Ken loved to play golf. He spent many hours on the golf course, enjoying the fresh air and the challenge of the game. He shared with me that his son would come to see him every week, a fact my wife also confirmed. During these visits, they would take the Celica out for a drive together. I thought they were planning to go play golf. Ken would share stories about how well he performed. He would share stories about hitting a ball deep into the thick grass or making 3 birdies one after another. He would also keep track of how many balls ended up in the water. Every week brought a new tale. On some weeks, he would find himself 3 over par after his handicap adjustments were made. At other times, he played exceptionally well and managed to be 1 stroke under par after taking his handicap into account. I didn't really enjoy golf myself, but my dad and brother played it all the time, so I knew a lot about the game. Each of his stories was unique, filled with interesting details, and told in a way that captivated everyone who listened. After we finished talking about the exciting highlights from the week's golf game, he would share with me his experiences as a man in the Air Force. He had many fascinating stories from World War II that he loved to recount. He worked in the Air Force for many years as a mechanic. Over time, he became a team leader, guiding his fellow mechanics. He also took on the important role of training new mechanics and sharing his knowledge and skills with them. After some time, he took on the role of a trade teacher at a technical college. He dedicated about 10 years to this job, sharing his knowledge and skills with students before he finally decided to retire. He shared many tales about creating new parts from whatever materials they could find to make things function properly. There were stories of failures and amusing incidents that happened in the workshop. And then there were the funny stories from his college days. It was a treasure trove of entertainment for me. As the weeks went by, I noticed that I was starting to leave work earlier and earlier on Fridays. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time to enjoy his company and create special moments together. Sometimes I would arrive and he wouldn't be around. My wife would then explain to me that he was in the hospital for a little while. I started to feel like I missed our little conversations. After about 9 months of this, everything started to change. This Friday felt like a return to our usual routine. He was no longer in the hospital and was sitting beside me on the church pew once again. He shared the story of the golf game they played during the week. I needed to use to the restroom, so I politely asked to be excused so I could go. When I returned, he was no longer there. I shared the news with my wife and she responded, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention it, but Ken passed away earlier this week." But I was right there having a conversation with him just before I went to the bathroom. He shared with me all the exciting details about the golf game. How could that possibly happen? Do you really think it's the same, Ken? The next week, I saw that his car was no longer parked in its usual place under the carport of his unit. Instead, it had been moved to the visitors' parking area, which was quite different from where it normally was. Instead of the usual vehicle, there was a big 4-wheel drive parked there. It had a large trailer attached to the back, and the trailer was partly filled with various pieces of furniture and several boxes stacked on top of each other. It caused me to pause and think for a moment. It felt like a sign that he was gone, but deep down, I still held on to the hope that he was alive and doing okay. After all, just a week before, we had been chatting and sharing stories. I strolled down to the unit and discovered his son busy sorting through the things inside. I took a moment to share my name and a little about who I am. He was aware of me. Ken had shared details about our conversations on Fridays. He said that his dad had died the Tuesday before. I didn't want to make him feel bad, so I decided to stay silent about our conversation from the week before, just 3 days after he had passed away. But now I had proof that it wasn't Ken's human body sitting on that church pew and talking to me. He continued by saying that his dad enjoyed being in front of people, and he hoped that he wasn't making me feel bored. In fact, it is very different from what you might think. We chatted for a little while about some of the confusing stories from the war and shared experiences from the Air Force. I mentioned how amazed I was that Ken still had such a sharp mind and could remember every detail of our golf games from each week. He looked very confused, as if he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. "Would you like to play a game of golf?" Yes, he would share all the details of each week's game, describing everything that happened. He then shared with me that Ken hadn't picked up a golf club in at least 10 years. I was completely shocked and couldn't believe what I was seeing. My son shared that every Thursday he would pick up Ken. They would first go to the cemetery to visit the grave of Ken's wife. After that, they would head to a cozy cafe for lunch together. Once they finished eating, they would do some grocery shopping. Finally, they would stop to fill up the car with fuel before heading back home. It takes about 4 to 5 hours in total. I would like to know approximately how much time he might need to complete a round of golf. He did not say anything about any of those activities at all. It really surprises me how he could remember so many details. The golf stories must have come from his own past experiences, because the way he described everything in such detail was just too vivid to be imagined. I was in high school and stayed with my mom in a small apartment on the 3rd floor. The apartment had only one bedroom, so my mom used it and I slept in the living room. There wasn't much space, but we made it work. Every morning I woke up at 6 a.m. to get ready for school, and my mom always got up at 5 a.m., so she had enough time to shower, prepare breakfast, and pack my lunch. After breakfast, she dropped me off at school before heading to her job. But that morning I woke up and noticed all the lights in the apartment were on. Every single one. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't there. I walked to the bathroom and saw that all the drawers and cabinet doors in the apartment were wide open. It made no sense and I felt really confused. Just then, my mom came out of the bathroom and asked me what on earth I had been doing. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about and asked if she had done it since she always woke up earlier than me. I also asked if she had seen my phone because I couldn't find it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, I saw something change in her green eyes. It was like she suddenly understood what was going on. Fear spread across her face as everything seemed to click in her mind. Without saying a word, she rushed to the kitchen and I followed her. The kitchen window was wide open, and on the floor, a kitchen knife was lying there like it had been dropped in a hurry. She looked closer and pointed at the dusty fingerprints on the wall near the window. It was clear someone had pushed against the wall to climb inside. That's when it finally hit me. Someone had climbed up to our balcony, gotten into our apartment, and stolen from us. They did all this while I was asleep on the couch in the living room, just a few steps away, and the thought made my skin crawl. My mom rushed over and hugged me tightly. She asked if I was okay, and I told her I hadn't heard anything. Not the lights being turned on, not the drawers opening, not even the person moving around the apartment. It felt strange to think someone had been so close to me while I slept. And I didn't even notice. My mind raced as I tried to remember anything unusual from the night before. But nothing came to me. It was like the whole thing happened in a dream, except it was terrifyingly real. It was so strange because I've always been a light sleeper, even as a kid, and I still am now. But somehow I didn't wake up that night. The person didn't open my mom's bedroom door, so she didn't notice anything either. My grandma says an angel must have protected me while I was asleep. But I don't believe in those things. I also don't think the robber knew I was there in the living room. The police never found out who did it. After that, we put steel bars on the kitchen window to feel safer. Even so, we decided to move to a new place not long after. This happened back when I was in high school, about 6 years ago. Now I'm older and living with my boyfriend, but I'm still paranoid about it. I keep wondering why I didn't wake up that night, but at the same time I feel grateful that I didn't. My brother says he sees ghosts in our apartment, and it's starting to scare me. It all started 2 years ago when he was 5. The first time it happened, he was sleeping in our mom's room. He usually sleeps in my room, but that night, he wanted to stay with her. So I had the bed all to myself that night, which I was happy about. After I fell asleep, I woke up around 4:15 a.m. I had to get up in 2 hours to get ready for school, so I just lay back down to try to sleep. About 30 seconds after I lay down, My whole body started to shake, and when I tried to sit up and move, I couldn't. That's when I realized I was having sleep paralysis. I couldn't speak or move, and I felt completely stuck. About 10 seconds into this, I heard someone talking behind my bed right above my head. The voice sounded so close, like it was just inches away from me. I was laying on my side, so my head was turned that way. I felt like if I could turn my head to look straight up, I would have been looking right at whatever was talking. It sounded like it could have been a man or a woman, but I couldn't tell. They were speaking in English, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. After what felt like a minute, I was able to move again, and the talking stopped. The feeling of my body still vibrating was there, but I could move now. The strange thing was I didn't feel scared, in danger, or threatened at all. After I calmed down, I just laid back down and went to sleep. But my brother went through something much scarier than me. I think a little before I had my experience, he woke up in the middle of the night. He turned toward our mom's side of the bed and saw something. He told me he saw a long woman, like someone really tall, walking toward our mom's side of the bed. She just stood there staring at our mom. He said it felt strange, like the woman wasn't really there, but he could still see her. I asked him what the woman looked like besides being long, and he said he couldn't remember. He quickly hid under the covers before he could get a good look at her. But he did say she had really long hair, though he couldn't remember the color. Then, a few weeks later, my brother had another strange experience. He was playing alone in the living room, while my mom and I were busy doing our own things. Then suddenly, my brother came to us and said that Dad came up behind him and hugged him. Now my mom and Dad were having a big fight and weren't talking at that time. So my mom had taken his apartment key away. This means there was no way he could have come in without us noticing, especially since he wasn't supposed to be around. There were a few other strange things that happened, but they aren't really important to go into detail about. Like we'd feel someone walking behind us, even though no one was there, or things would go missing and then show up in the most obvious places, like right in front of us. But when our grandma came over with some sage, the strange activity stopped and everything went back to normal. I'm a 24-year-old female, and I recently started living in an apartment in the city after moving from my parents' home in the suburbs. At home, I always used the garage keypad to get inside, so I never got used to locking the front door, and I didn't think much about it until one summer night when a stranger walked into my apartment. Now we need to explain a bit how the entrance to my apartment works because it's important. My roommate and I live in a basement unit under the main building, and our windows face an alley with dumpsters, and there are often creepy people in the alley doing weird things. Our front door is behind a heavy main door that stays locked. This door leads to the fire escape and other apartments, which are also locked. However, the fire escape is easy to get to by climbing, and that makes our front door easy to match too. Then one weekend this summer, I had some friends over for drinks before we went out to the bars, when one of my friends told me that a strange, hazy-looking older man had walked into our hallway, looked around and left through the heavy back door. Now we thought he was just a drunk guest who got confused and couldn't find his way out. It seemed odd though, because if you're on the fire escape, it's pretty clear which way leads outside. Now that same night, I woke up around 4 a.m. because my kitten and the Jack Russell puppy I was watching for the weekend were playing in my room. I stayed in bed for about 10 minutes listening to them when I suddenly heard my door open. My roommate wasn't home, so I was alone with a 7-month-old puppy and a 6-month-old kitten who couldn't really help me. I heard footsteps in my hallway. My bedroom door was wide open and my windows had bars on them, so I quickly realized I didn't have a way to escape. Whoever it was didn't seem confused, since my apartment looks very different from the others, and it would be clear they were in the wrong place. Then the puppy started growling and barking from my room. I'm probably lucky the puppy stayed in my room. If she hadn't, the person might have quickly realized she wasn't a real threat. He shut the door behind him, and I heard him leave through the heavy door in a hurry. I might have thought it was an accident if my door wasn't the only one on that floor, or if I had heard noise on the fire escape before he came in, but he entered so quietly. The fact that it happened twice in one night Makes me think someone knew my door might be unlocked. Of all nights to be babysitting a dog, I'm so thankful it was that one. I'm also glad I was awake and paying attention. I'll never know what could have happened. It could have ended very badly. Now I always remember to lock my door. Lesson learned. I'm a person of science, so I've never believed in anything paranormal. But currently, I'm having some experiences I just can't explain. So my girlfriend and I recently bought an apartment. Small and old, but it's close to our jobs and was surprisingly cheap. We figured the price made it worth it. But after we moved in, we noticed an issue we hadn't faced before. Like our cat began behaving really strangely, and we kept finding things tipped over in the living room. Like books, picture frames, and even small decorations. And at night, we often heard thuds and bangs that made us both uneasy. Now our cat, who was usually calm and well-behaved, had never acted like this before. She would dart around the apartment, meowing loudly and staring at empty corners as if she saw something we couldn't. At first, I thought it was just because of the move. Maybe she was nervous and needed time to get used to the smaller space. So I kept telling myself it was normal and hoped she would settle down soon. Then one evening, as my girlfriend and I lay in bed watching a movie on her laptop, a loud crash echoed through the apartment. It sounded like glass breaking in the living room. I got up to see what had happened and found a flower vase shattered on the floor. The pieces were scattered everywhere, and water was dripping onto the carpet. I sighed and said, "Looks like Cupcake got a bit too wild." But when I turned to my girlfriend, she was standing at the doorway, holding Cupcake in her arms. She shook her head and said, "No, she didn't. Cupcake has been in the bedroom with us the whole time. Maybe there's a mouse hiding somewhere. Or maybe the wind is blowing in through a crack. Or the building isn't completely even, making things fall." Even when we found a chair tipped over, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. But sure, it's hard to believe a cat or mouse could do that. But who knows? Then last weekend, something even stranger happened. My girlfriend took Cupcake and went to her parents' place for a few days. So I was alone in the apartment, but the place felt unusually quiet without them. I was making breakfast in the kitchen, just getting the pan ready, when I suddenly heard a loud bang from the fridge. It sounded like someone had hit it really hard, almost like a punch. I froze for a second, wondering if something had fallen inside. I went over and opened the fridge door, but nothing had moved. I thought maybe the fridge was malfunctioning, but I couldn't find any explanation that made sense, and the noise was too loud and clear to just ignore. Later the same day, one of the weirdest things happened. We always keep a candle on the living room table, but when I got home from work, it wasn't there. Instead, I found it broken in two across the room. Looked like someone had slapped it all the way over there. I know for sure it was on the table when I left that morning, and no one had been in the apartment all day. I know these things might not seem like a big deal on their own, but together it's starting to creep me out. Last Sunday evening around 7:30, I was in the rear bedroom of my apartment, focused on assembling a new dresser I had recently bought. The door to the bedroom was open, allowing me to see straight down the hallway into the living room, and my fiancé was there with the kids who were busy playing. When suddenly there was a knock at the door. My 6-year-old son ran to the door and opened it, even though he knows he shouldn't. We're still teaching him not to do that, but he was excited after his birthday party and probably thought someone was coming by for him, even though the party was over. At the door, a woman was standing, and I recognized her as a neighbor from upstairs. She said she needed help and walked straight into our apartment. She started talking quickly and saying confusing things. She claimed she was locked out of the building, even though she was inside. Then she said she could get into her apartment, but not the building. And in the next moment, she said she couldn't get into her apartment. She seemed very confused and kept repeating that she was really tired or exhausted. She was unsteady on her feet. Her speech was messy and she seemed a bit dazed. She kept repeating herself and talking in circles, saying her parents would be very worried if she didn't check in with them, even though I knew she lived alone. Then she kept asking us to call phone numbers for her. She had her phone in her hand, set to video record mode, but it wasn't recording. In her pocket, she was rolling something around over and over. It looked like a screwdriver. As she gave my Beyoncé numbers to dial, she couldn't remember the full numbers. Every number she gave was too short and not a real phone number. When I told her the numbers she gave weren't long enough to be real phone numbers, she would start saying a new number but stop halfway through. This happened 7 or 8 times, and I finally got frustrated. She kept saying her phone wasn't working, so I let her try using mine. But instead of using it, she just stood there holding it, not dialing anything, and kept talking nonsense. I was very upset and uneasy by this point. This woman had walked into my apartment without being invited and was acting strangely around my kids. I told my fiancé to take the kids to the back of the house. Then I tried to get the woman to leave by saying, "Let's go check your apartment. Come with me and we'll see if it's open." I tried to lead her out of my apartment, but she said she was so tired and needed to sit down. Then she just sat down on my living room couch. I wasn't happy about this at all. Actually, I was really mad. But I stayed calm and reminded myself she is our neighbor and I should help her. But on the other hand, my fiancé quietly moved behind her to make sure. She couldn't go any farther into the living room or near the kids. After about 5 minutes of her to come with me to check her apartment, she finally walked slowly out. I was already a few steps ahead of her, telling her to follow me. On the way, she tried to go into 2 other apartments that weren't hers, and each time I told her that wasn't her room. Now, when I got to her apartment, the door was wide open. She hadn't caught up to me yet, so I quickly looked inside. The couch cushions were all over the place, and the living room looked messy and upside down. She caught up with me, but tried again to get into another neighbor's apartment across the hall. I stopped her again and got her to go inside, and when she did, she apologized and said, "I'm sorry, this is how we had to meet. I'm just so exhausted." I told her it was okay and went back downstairs. But I felt uneasy, and I decided to call the police. Then after a while, the police arrived and knocked on her door, but there was no answer, so they left. At 04:15 a.m., my 6-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter were still asleep, and so were my fiancé and I. I got up to use the bathroom. While I was in the bathroom, I heard a soft knock on the apartment door. The knock was so soft that I actually wondered if I had heard it. I called out to my fiancé to ask if she heard it too. She said she didn't hear anything. We both went to the living room to see if we could hear anything else. No sooner had we stepped into the living room than we heard scratching at the front door. The sound of someone clawing at your door is something I never want to hear in the middle of the night. It's truly terrifying. I told my fiancé to stay with the kids and make sure they were okay. I opened the door and found the woman from earlier, standing at the top of the stairs in front of my apartment, just staring down at the door. It was really scary. I told her there was no way we were doing this again. I called her crazy and told her to leave my apartment and stay away from my family. She said nothing, just listened, then walked out, probably back to her apartment. I called the police right away. They came and asked her questions, which she answered well enough for them to say there was nothing they could do. This woman was clearly not okay, and was now bothering me and my family, making us feel unsafe and disturbing the peace in our home. Ever since she first came into the apartment acting strange, I've had this heavy feeling in my stomach, and an uneasy feeling that whatever this is isn't over.